welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we are plunging into this really interesting stack of sources you shared with us, all focused on halal.
Yeah, it's a word we hear a lot, but the sources show just how much is packed into it. It's way more than just food.
Absolutely. So our mission today in this deep dive is to take all that material, the articles, the notes, everything, and kind of boil it down for you.
Right. We want to unpack what halal actually means, what's forbidden or haram.
And get into those specifics, like how halal meat is prepared, which is fascinating.
And then broaden out, see how it fits into life beyond the dinner table. And look at the sheer size of the global halal industry. It's huge.
Definitely. We'll also touch on some of those complex areas, the differing views, how it all works in the modern world. Certification, too.
It's all in there.
Think of us as sorting through it all with you, pulling out the key stuff.
Let's unpack this.
Okay, so first things first, the word itself, halal. What are we actually talking about?
Well, at its core, halal is Arabic. It means permissible or lawful.
Lawful according to Islamic law.
Exactly. It's defined by the main sources, the Quran and the Hadith, which are the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions.
And straight away, it's clear this isn't just a food thing.
Not at all. Food's a big part, obviously. But halal really connects to a broader idea, like a clean way of life, purity, moral standards. It's about physical and spiritual well-being.
So the focus on food comes from that larger principle, ensuring what you consume is lawful, good for you in that whole sense.
Precisely. It needs to align with those broader values.
Got it. So if halal is what's allowed, the flip side is knowing what's not allowed, what's prohibited.
Right. Understanding haram, the unlawful, is key.
Okay, and here's where the sources get really specific. It's not just like one or two things.
No, definitely not. Though some things are absolute non-starters. Pork, for example, explicitly forbidden. Full stop.
Okay. And alcohol.
Also fundamentally forbidden. But this is where you start seeing the nuances pop up in the sources. Well, it's not just about drinking alcohol. It's about alcohol that might end up in food or even in medicine.
Yeah, I saw that. The differing views on tiny amounts or when it's like super diluted.
Exactly. That concept of Istihlak, extreme dilution. Some scholars might say a minuscule, non-intoxicating trace could be permissible if it's essentially vanished into the product.
But not everyone agrees.
Definitely not. Others are much stricter. Some viewpoints say any addition of a non-halal substance, diluted or not, makes the whole thing problematic. And there's even differentiation, like between alcohol added intentionally versus tiny amounts from natural fermentation.
Wow, okay, so even there it's complex. What else is on the haram list?
Foods containing blood. That's a clear one.
Right.
And meat from certain types of animals, predators, birds of prey, scavengers, things like that.
Which naturally leads us to the meat that is allowed and how it gets that way. The slaughter method.
Yes. Dhabiha. That's the specific term for the Islamic method of slaughter. For meat and poultry to count as halal, the process has to follow these guidelines very carefully.
And your sources listed quite a few conditions. What are the really critical ones?
Okay, first off, the animal absolutely has to be alive and healthy right before slaughter. No sick animals, no pregnant ones.
And the tool.
A very sharp knife is essential. The cut needs to be quick, decisive, ideally one continuous motion across the throat without lifting the knife mid-cut.
And there's a religious element, right? An invocation.
Yes, that's mandatory. The slaughterer, who must be a sane adult Muslim, man or woman, has to invoke Allah's name right at the moment of slaughter, usually saying, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
And one source mentioned contrast with kosher practice here.
Yeah, it pointed out that in kosher slaughter, sometimes one prayer covers a batch of animals, whereas in halal, it's generally understood to be required for each individual animal.
Hygiene is also stressed, isn't it?
Hugely important. You absolutely cannot use a knife for halal slaughter if it's ever been used for slaughtering pigs.
Makes sense.
And there are other recommended practices, too, aimed at kindness to the animal, like offering it water beforehand, not slaughtering it when it's hungry, making sure it doesn't see the knife.
Or see other animals being slaughtered.
Exactly. Keep it calm, minimize distress.
And the process doesn't end with the cut, right? You have to wait.
Correct. You don't sever the head completely during the cut, and you absolutely wait until the animal is completely dead before you start skinning or cutting any other parts. Full exsanguination has to occur.
Now, some people claim this method is cruel. One source addressed that.
It did, and it argued the opposite, that the Islamic method, when done correctly, is designed for maximum efficiency and minimal suffering. The sharp knife, the specific cut location. It's all aimed at a very rapid loss of consciousness and blood pressure.
Okay. What about fish and seafood? Seems simpler there.
Oh, much simpler. Generally, all types of seafood are considered halal. Doesn't matter how they were caught or if they were alive or dead when landed. That's a key difference compared to land animals.
Okay, so we've got the basics, halal versus haram, the details of Dhabiha. But the sources make it really clear halal has grown way beyond just the food counter.
It absolutely has. It's moved towards being seen as this holistic concept. It touches the whole value chain, not just the final product.
So beyond food, where is this applying?
Well, think pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, health products, toiletries, even medical devices. The sources specifically mention certification categories for these.
Wow.
And then there's the service sector too, logistics, marketing, packaging, finance. If you want a certified halal final product, often the whole chain leading up to it needs scrutiny.
Even lifestyle things? Travel, fashion?
Definitely. Halal travel and tourism is a growing area. Halal-friendly hospitality and modest fashion linked to halal principles. And finance is a really big one.
Right. The sources heavily emphasize riba.
Yes, the prohibition of usury or interest. That's a core principle in Islamic finance, which is a huge part of the halal ecosystem.
And it's treated very seriously.
Extremely seriously. One source cited a hadith that equates knowingly consuming riba as being more severe than multiple acts of major sin. It really highlights that financial dealings are just as subject to halal rules as food is.
And digging into non-food ingredients, things you might not expect need checking too.
Exactly. Gelatin is a classic example. Where did it come from? Could be pork, could be beef, not slaughtered halali. Whey sometimes has non-halal additives. Even things like carmine, a red dye from insects, raise questions for some.
Similar to concerns in kosher rules, like with cheese enzymes.
Yeah, very similar concerns. Animal enzymes in cheese are often problematic for kosher, and you see parallel discussions in halal about ensuring any enzymes used are from halal slaughtered animals or non-animal sources.
This massive expansion, the complexity, it all points to the incredible scale of the global halal industry that the sources describe.
It's staggering, really. The estimates put the global halal market, excluding Islamic finance, in the trillions of US dollars. It's genuinely one of the fastest growing consumer markets on the planet.
What's pushing that growth so hard?
It's a mix of things. Firstly, you have demographics. Islam is the world's fastest growing religion, so the core consumer base is expanding.
Okay, that makes sense.
But interestingly, it's not just Muslims driving it. The sources point to a rising number of non-Muslim consumers actively choosing halal products.
Why would they do that?
Often for reasons related to perceived quality, safety, or ethical standards. Like that example from the UK.
Yeah, the 6 million halal meat consumers versus 2 million Muslims.
Exactly. That gap speaks volumes about the crossover appeal, whether it's about animal welfare perceptions or just trust in the certification process.
Plus the economic factor within Muslim community.
Absolutely. Growing populations combined with rising disposable incomes in many Muslim-majority countries or among Muslim communities elsewhere means more purchasing power.
And maybe greater awareness now, too.
Yes, that's mentioned too. A greater awareness among Muslims themselves about checking for halal status and understanding the requirements.
And geographically, where's the boon happening most?
Asia is highlighted as the fastest growing region. Makes sense. Largest Muslim population. The Middle East is obviously a huge established market, often relying on imports. Europe's market is growing steadily with its Muslim population. And even places like China are noted as developing their own standards and markets.
And it's not just about volume, it's about sophistication, too.
Definitely. Demand is growing for higher-end halal products.
Yeah.
People are looking more closely at, ingredient origins, health aspects, overall quality, similar trends you see in the mainstream market, really.
So, okay, we've got this comprehensive system, this huge global industry, and then inevitably we run into the complexities and the differing interpretations that your sources really dig into. This feels like the core of the deep dive.
It really is. Because, understanding the core Sharia principles is one thing, but applying them across centuries, different cultures, new technologies, that's where it gets tricky.
How do scholars handle that, like applying old principles to new things?
Well, jurists make a distinction. They look at the timeless principle versus the specific practices or tools of a particular time. So things like mechanical slaughter using machines or doing business contracts over email, these weren't around 1,400 years ago. Interpreting how the principles apply now requires careful thought.
Are there, like, guiding rules for these gray areas?
Yes, there are established legal maxims in Islamic jurisprudence. Things like difficulty begets facility, which means if adhering strictly is excessively burdensome, some leniency might be allowed. Or necessity renders prohibited things permissible.
But applying those isn't always straightforward, like the alcohol example again.
Exactly. Necessity might permit something otherwise forbidden, but what constitutes necessity and under what conditions? That's where scholarly debate and different conclusions come in.
And what about things that are just uncertain, where you can't be sure if it's halal or haram?
That's the concept of shubha doubtful matters. The general advice, rooted in prophetic tradition, is to err on the side of caution and avoid things whose status is unclear. Better safe than sorry, basically.
Okay. And what about when something forbidden is completely changed, like chemically transformed?
That's Istihala transformation. This is a really interesting area. Some scholars argue that if a haram substance, say fat from a non-halali slaughtered animal, is chemically altered so radically that it becomes a completely new substance with different properties like soap, then it might become permissible because essentially the original forbidden thing no longer exists.
And the idea of tiny, tiny amounts getting mixed in.
Yeah, that relates to concepts sometimes called consumption or assimilation. The argument, again held by some, is that if a minuscule amount of a haram ingredient gets lost in a much larger halal mixture to the point where its taste, smell, color are completely gone, then that trace amount might be considered negligible, like it's been consumed or assimilated by the dominant halal substance.
But again, not universal agreement on that.
Definitely not. More cautious views would argue that any amount of haram ingredient, no matter how small or transformed, makes the whole product haram. So you see a spectrum of opinion here, reflecting different approaches to interpreting the core texts and principles.
And one of the biggest areas of differing views, according to the sources, seems to be about meat slaughtered by Jews and Christians, the people of the book.
Yes, this is a major point of discussion, and it really hinges on how you interpret a specific verse in the Quran, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 5. It says, "The food of the people of the book is lawful for Muslims."
Sounds simple, but the interpretations diverge quite a bit.
They really do. One major line of interpretation associated with scholars like Maududi emphasizes the method of slaughter. They argue their food means food slaughtered according to their valid religious practices, which must also align with core Islamic requirements, like invoking God's name and proper bleeding.
So under that view, if they don't follow steps equivalent to Dhabiha, it's not halal.
Essentially, yes. If they don't invoke God's name as understood in Islam, or if they use methods like stunning that might render the animal dead before the cut, or if the animal itself isn't permissible in Islam, like pork, obviously, then even if they slaughtered it, it wouldn't be halal for Muslims, according to this view. This often leads to the conclusion that most standard meat in Western supermarkets isn't halal.
Okay, what's the other main perspective?
The other perspective, supported by scholars like Al-Qaradawi, interprets the verse more broadly. They argue that if the people of the book consider the food lawful according to their religion, and it doesn't contain anything explicitly forbidden in Islam itself, like pork or blood, then it is permissible for Muslims based on the allowance in that verse.
So that view is more focused on whether they consider it lawful by their standards.
Largely, yes. It takes the verse more at face value, suggesting a specific allowance was given regarding their food, as long as the fundamental prohibitions of Islam aren't violated. This view can be more accommodating towards, say, kosher meat, or potentially even some meat from Christian butchers if they follow certain practices like invoking God's name in their tradition.
Wow. So, yeah, one verse, but quite different practical outcomes depending on the interpretive lens. Okay, with all this potential for variation and this absolutely massive global market, it makes total sense why certification has become so critical.
It's fundamentally about trust and verification in a complex supply chain. Consumers, especially those buying processed or imported goods, need some assurance that what they're buying actually meets halal standards. Certification bodies provide that third-party check.
What's generally involved in getting certified? It sounds thorough.
It is. The sources outline a process that typically starts with an application, then a deep dive into documentation. We're talking ingredient lists, supplier declarations, processing flowcharts, even the layout of the factory floor.
To check for what exactly?
To check for any haram ingredients, obviously, but also to assess risks of cross-contamination. Like, are halal and non-halal materials stored separately? Are cleaning procedures adequate?
And then they visit the site.
Yes, audits are key. Usually involves reviewing the paperwork and doing physical inspections of the facility. They watch the processes, check storage, talk to staff, verify everything matches the documented procedures and meets the specific halal standard being applied.
How long does certification take, roughly?
One source mentioned a ballpark of maybe 4 to 7 weeks for the initial process, but it varies. And then you have ongoing audits, maybe once or twice a year, to make sure standards are maintained.
The sources busted a myth too, right?
Yeah.
About blessing equipment.
Yeah, they clarified that simply blessing machinery isn't part of standard halal certification. It's about the tangible things: ingredients, process control, preventing contamination, and also, importantly, the certification applies to the facility's capability to produce halal, ensuring their whole system is compliant, not just blessing one batch of product.
But the big elephant in the room, mentioned repeatedly, is the lack of one single global halal standard.
That's a major, major challenge. You have numerous certification bodies around the world, sometimes even multiple bodies within one country, and they don't always use the exact same standards or interpretations, especially on those tricky issues like stunning or mechanical slaughter.
Which must cause problems.
Huge problems. For businesses, it means maybe needing multiple certifications for different export markets. For consumers, it can lead to confusion: which logo can I trust? Does this certification mean the same thing everywhere? It definitely impacts confidence and can hinder the market's potential.
Although some places are trying to fix that.
Yes. Countries like Malaysia, for example, have invested heavily in developing comprehensive national standards and promoting themselves as a kind of global hub or benchmark for halal certification. But a truly unified, globally accepted standard, that's still elusive.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up, bringing all these threads from the sources together. What's the big picture on halal?
I think the big picture is that halal is this incredibly rich and far-reaching concept. It starts with clear principles from Islamic law, yes, but it extends out to influence diet, lifestyle, ethics, massive global industries, finance, pretty much everything.
We went from permissible and forbidden through the very specific rules for meat, looked at ingredients, the different ways scholars interpret things.
And then saw how this translates into a multi-trillion-dollar global market, facing challenges like standardization.
It's clear it's not simple. Understanding halal means looking at the principles, sure, but also the context, the modern applications, and respecting that there's diversity in interpretation among knowledgeable scholars.
Absolutely. It's a living tradition being applied in a really dynamic world.
Definitely more than just a label on food packaging. It's a whole system, a way of life that's also become a powerful economic force.
Wouldn't have said it better.
So here's something to think about. We've seen this massive, expanding global halal market: food, finance, tourism, cosmetics, you name it. We've also seen the crucial role of certification in building trust within that market. But we've also highlighted this persistent challenge, the lack of a single unified international halal standard. So how do you think this ongoing fragmentation, these different interpretations and certifications, will ultimately impact the future growth and integrity of the global halal economy? And what does it mean for both the businesses trying to operate globally and the consumers, Muslim and non-Muslim, who rely on these labels? What further conversations does this spark for you about that intersection of deeply held religious practice, global trade, and the everyday challenge of consumer trust?